Hi, welcome to the second recording for Chapter 11 of Business and Finance. We've been looking in this chapter already at governance and what corporate governance really means. We've been discussing the agency problem, we've been discussing the agency, the agency theory. What I want to look at now is what happens when there's poor corporate governance. What are the symptoms of poor corporate governance that we need to consider? And what I will say straight away is we'll obviously work through these symptoms, but in your study manual there is an example. I believe the company is called TechPoint, and if you've got the 2017 study manual, it's on page 289, which hopefully you do have the 2017 study manual, page 289, and that will just give you a nice worked through, I won't say real life, but a nice example of what a company with poor corporate governance looks like. And although I would certainly recommend you have a look at that, it might not make as much sense right now until after we've looked at Chapter 12 with the UK Corporate Governance Code. But either way, we'll run through these symptoms, but it's nice to see how they fit back into a business scenario, so absolutely do have a look at that. Okay, so bearing in mind what we know already about corporate governance, what are these symptoms? So absolutely, if there's a domination of the board by anybody, any single individual or group, the board is made up of, or should be made up of, a diverse group of individuals, each bringing certain skills and knowledge to the table. And when some of these members are ignored, then actually that board is not effective. It's not working as it should be. That's not good corporate governance. Another problem is that you can often find board members acting very independently. So when you have executive directors, so members of the board that also have a full-time role with the business, for example, your finance director, they all have day-to-day jobs that they have to do. And a big problem can be that actually the board doesn't meet regularly enough. It doesn't consider overall, for example, the risks that we're faced. So everybody's acting individually, they're doing their own day-to-day jobs, but nobody's coming together to think about the bigger picture. Control function. So we've spoken about internal controls previously in the course, but for example, if there's no internal audit, or at the very least somebody who has a good knowledge in all of those key roles around the business, this can be a problem for a business. Internal audit is a nice, I'm going to put the term independent in inverted commas there, but it gives you a nice independent review of your controls, and for a shareholder that provides a really key piece of reassurance. It might be a problem in terms of supervision of employees, which again obviously leads to a lack of controls. It could be lack of independent scrutiny, not only by internal auditors but also by my external auditors. A lack of contact with the shareholders, and again when we come on to look at Chapter 12, we'll consider the requirement for regular AGMs, for example, to make sure that directors are communicating and interacting with the very people that they're supposed to be representing. We've spoken already in the previous recording about short-term profitability and the problem with focusing on short-term profitability at the expense of long-term growth or long-term shareholder wealth. And then finally, this problem around directors producing misleading financial statements. So that's the bad. What's good then? What do we actually mean by good corporate governance generally? And the great thing about this Chapter 11 is corporate governance is not a UK issue or a UK centered theory. It's a global idea. And Chapter 12 looks specifically at the UK Corporate Governance Code, but Chapter 11 gives us this kind of overview. So what do we actually mean by good practice? Well, good practice really should be thinking about how good are we at risk management, ethics, thinking about sustainability, thinking about all of the behaviour of the board, thinking about my senior management, my shareholders, external auditors, internal auditors. So there's a big long list of considerations to be made. So we've got a few examples of good practice then for corporate governance listed here below. So making sure we've got a good risk management and reduction focus. So I need to know that my board are considering what are my risks and how do we deal with them. It's really important. It's not impossible for a business to remove all risk, but what's really important is the business knows how they're going to deal with it. Are we ensuring that there's a focus on sustainability? As I say, sustainability is really key. Making sure that we have a long-term perspective. So, making sure that we're thinking about long-term success rather than, reckless misuse of resources in the short term. Obviously, you'd expect those who control the business to be open and transparent, making sure that all the information provided to shareholders and other stakeholders is true. Making sure we're again adopting integrity and honesty, applying the spirit of the law as well as its letter. So making sure that everything we do, we're being honest and straightforward. Making sure that our performance as directors is being monitored and judged. And again, when we look at Chapter 12, there's a process within the UK Corporate Governance Code that will ensure that the directors or the board of directors is constantly, or at least annually, reviewing their own performance. Making sure we've removed potential for conflict and making sure that this key relationship, these key interests are reconciled. Okay, so trying to align the interests of shareholders and directors. So for example, rather than giving me a profit-based bonus scheme, why don't we have some sort of share option? Okay, so if I do well as a director, give me the option to buy shares rather than a profit-related bonus. This way, everybody, both shareholders and directors, wants the share price to increase as much as possible. So those are a few examples of good practice. We're going to move on to start thinking about the more kind of practical bits and pieces here. Firstly, thinking about what affects the type of governance or the focus of on governance that a business will have. And the first thing we look at here is the type of financial system that the business is operating in. Now, this will have a big impact on the importance of and the way in which corporate governance is rolled out. So we're going to look at two different financial systems. We're going to look at the bank-based system and we're going to look at the market-based system. I'm going to start actually with the market-based system purely because that's what we have in the UK, so it might be a bit more, or hopefully be a bit more familiar to you. So, excuse me. One characteristic of a market-based system is that the markets are a more important source of finance than bank finance. So, for example, in the UK, we know that the markets are where we go to get our funding as a business. You tend to find that households have higher risk appetites. You tend to find less government regulation, and the relationships with the bank for a business are less close, certainly much less close than on a bank-based system. Now, what I want to do is just consider again the relationship between my shareholders, the company, and the directors. When we talk about the market being the biggest source of finance, what we're essentially talking about, in part at least, a major part, are these guys, are the shareholders. Now, if I'm relying on people, on individual, on institutional shareholders, like a pension scheme, for example, if I'm relying on these people funding my expansion or funding my next project, and as the UK, that's certainly the case, the relationship between these guys is going to be vitally important, and therefore, really, really important that this governance is taken seriously. Not that it's not the case in a bank-based system, but we need to think about the differences. Okay, a bank-based system then, which we see in Germany, we see in France, we also see in Japan. This is where actually businesses tend to go to the bank for most of their finance. So it's a much more important source of finance than the markets. Part of the reason for that is that we tend to find in these economies or in these markets, in these systems, households have a lower risk appetite. So rather than households going out and buying shares within a company, they prefer to put their money in the bank. The bank then will invest that almost on their behalf. Tends to be more government regulation due to problems in the past. And actually, the bank and businesses have a really, really close relationship. Not only holding shares or equity in each other, so the bank will hold equity in the business will hold equity in the bank. Also, the bank has a very close relationship in terms of being provided with detailed financial info, and also often have a seat on the board, which you would expect. Considering the closeness of that relationship, the bank wants to have some sort of control over how the business and how its investment is going to be managed. So what we really need to appreciate is the difference that these two systems will have on how the company or how the business approaches corporate governance. Even thinking back to our different perspectives on corporate governance, anything that focuses primarily on shareholders, we know is going to be really important in that market-based system. Stakeholders as a whole, then including banks, will be more important in the bank-based system. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to Section 7. Section 7 is looking at governance structure. And governance structure is just the tools, the methods that are put in place to make sure that we have a good form of corporate governance. And this can be statutory, it can be non-statutory, but essentially what we do to make sure that corporate governance is effective. Okay, so we're going to have a look at two different approaches. We're going to look at a principles-based approach, and we're going to look at a shareholder-led approach. Now, already, when I'm thinking about, for example, this term shareholder-led, I'm thinking back to those different types of financial system that we've just seen. And I know, for example, in a market-based system, that shareholders are the key relationship. I know that the majority of investment comes from the markets. So when I'm thinking about that type of system or that type of financial system, a shareholder-led approach sounds like it's going to be key to that. Okay, let's have a look. So the principles-based approach is an attempt to adhere to the OECD's principles of corporate governance. So we've got those listed beneath. Now, what I will point out is it's not like we're looking at two completely different ends of the spectrum here: principles-based and shareholder-led. Lots of the kind of ideas are going to be common. So, what are those principles? Should be transparent and efficient financial markets. The framework should protect and facilitate shareholders' rights. Should ensure the equitable treatment of all shareholders, including minorities. So we can't just focus on those big shareholders. There should be an equal focus on everybody. Obviously recognizing the rights of stakeholders as a wider group, so not just shareholders. Ensuring that any disclosure is made in a timely way on material matters, so those things that can affect economic decisions. And ensuring overall that the board is effective. So those are the principles that a principle-based approach will try to adhere to. And as I said, particularly then in the UK, where we have this market-based system, so in particular institutional shareholders being very important to the financing of business generally, we have to have a greater focus then, a greater emphasis on shareholders. And as I said, when we talk about institutional shareholders, we're just talking about people who invest money on behalf of other people. So, for example, the pension fund, when you pay your pension contribution each month, your pension fund will then take that and invest it for you. So that would be an institutional shareholder. And they're a massive part of this market-based system. So because of that, we just make sure that there's a focus on shareholders. And at the bottom here, just to point out, we should make sure that actually those shareholders should have a close relationship with the board. So make sure there's a constant dialogue there. Okay, last few bits for the chapter then. Firstly, 7.4 gives me a few different structures for the board. So remember, corporate governance is all about how we control and direct the business. We know that that's centered on the board of directors, how the board of directors behaves. And we're just going to look at two different types of board structure. Again, could certainly be asked a couple of multiple choice questions or a multiple choice question in the exam on this. So we'll start with the simplest. Over on the left hand side here, we've got a unitary board. So one level board, which we see in the UK. One board, one level of a board, responsible for both management of the business and also reporting to shareholders. So we have that dual purpose of a single board. Over on the right hand side then we have it slightly more complicated, common in Germany, where we have a two-tier board, so a dual board structure. And we split the board then into the management board, which is to do with managing the business, and the supervisory board. So this is where we have an independent board elected by the shareholders and employees, and this is where they have power, for example, to appoint and remove members of the management board, to request information from the members of the management board, to inspect books and records, to perform independent reviews. If you think about some of these tasks, actually, we still see that with a unitary board, but we tend not to have a distinct separation. So, for example, performing independent reviews would be something that the audit committee in the UK would look at. So, still a subcommittee of the unitary board. So it's all down to that distinct separation between running the business and then everything else that the board is responsible for. Okay, last section then for the chapter, and obviously for the recording, section 8 then looking at ethics. So section 8 is fairly straightforward, just thinking about how we behave. So definition here of ethics, a system of behaviour deemed acceptable in society. And what we're trying to get at here is business values, business ethics are something that should be promoted by the board and kind of pushed down through the business then. So what is an ethical culture? An ethical culture is one where the business will attempt to influence people to behave in line with what they believe to be correct. So behaving in a way, as we said, in an ethical way, a way that's deemed acceptable in society. We've got a couple of different models here for us to look at. Excuse me. Firstly, we've got the Nolan principles, then we're going to move on to look at the values laid out by Philippa Foster Beck over the page. So the Nolan principle, just give me a starting point. They say, look, this is what we can consider as a business to have important to us. So integrity, making sure that everything that we do as a business, straightforward and honest, making sure that people are working in that way. Objectivity, so no bias there. Accountability, accountable for our actions as a business. Openness and honesty. So like I said, relatively straightforward, all things that we should strive to display as a business. Philippa Foster Beck then added a couple of extras, so fairly similar: truthfulness, transparency and openness, fairness and responsibility. You could be asked to pick out principles suggested by Nolan, suggested by Philippa Foster Beck, so do bear that in mind. So put that on your list of things to memorize, unfortunately. Let's move on and have a think, in a bigger sense, what we mean by business ethics. So, interactive question 1 just has a question here, just to list some examples of acceptable business ethics. So, what we need to do is just list a few examples of things that a business will do that is ethical, things that a business does that goes along with this idea of being good, of being acceptable to society. So I'll give you one as an example to kind of get you going. So think about paying decent wages. Okay, so legally they may be able to get around paying lower wages, but an ethical behaviour would be paying a living wage or decent wages. So as always, what I'd like you to do is to pause the recording here. Have a go at just listing yourself 3 or 4 different examples of acceptable business ethics, and then hit play and we'll have a chat together. Okay, if you pause now. Okay, hopefully you've got a few examples there then. Let's just see if we can bump that up to 4 in total. Again, don't worry if we're not matching exactly. Obviously, there are hundreds of things that we could list here, but as long as you're along the right lines. What could we go with? Well, let's think about the different stakeholders that are going to be affected. So think about how we advertise to our customers, making sure that we're honest in what we say the product or the service does, making sure that that's actually in line, making sure that we use responsible sourcing. So making sure that all the materials I use are responsible. So for example, fair trade, ensuring that we're not taking advantage of poor farming conditions or something like that. And I guess sticking to suppliers, then why don't we say paying suppliers on time? Might not be best for my working capital, but it's an ethical way to behave. Okay, and in terms of how a business can go out and actually promote these activities, making sure that the behavior is shown right from the top. So it's really important for something like this to be demonstrated from the top. So making sure that my board of directors behave in an ethical way. Have some sort of code of ethics, so include that perhaps in your employee handbook. And again, make sure that you use that code of ethics then to kind of move on and make sure that all your policies and procedures are in place to ensure that we behave in a way that's suitable in terms of my code of ethics. Okay, brilliant. So that's the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 then, we'll move on to look at the UK Corporate Governance Code in a bit more detail. So we'll run through the 5 main sections of the UK Corporate Governance Code next up in chapter